Okay, so rigging is a three-part process. The first part is building a skeleton for the model. The second point is binding so that the joints know which parts of the body they control. And then the third point is making controls for the joints. And as we get to each one, we'll talk about them in more detail. The first thing that I need to do when I start rigging is set my workspace up for rigging, and there are two things that you can do. The first one is you can switch your workspace from General over to Rigging. That does three things. The first is that it opens this node editor at the bottom of the screen, and the node editor is great. What it lets you do is it lets you make direct connections between objects. So I can tell one object to control another object right here without having to do any additional work. We're not going to need the node editor for a few weeks, so just keep in the back of your head that this window may not be necessary to you at all, ever. Up here I have switched my shelf from my regular rigging shelf, this one, over to the Maya rigging shelf with all of its icons that I do not need, because these icons really just replace some of the features of these menus across the top: skeleton, skin, deform, constrain. Now this menu up here is actually important. This is where all of my rigging tools are. So what I usually do when I'm setting myself up to start rigging is not switch over to the rigging workspace. I usually stay here in General, and here in the General workspace I have a little more screen real estate. I have my regular custom rigging shelf that I'm going to use. I know that you don't have one. That's okay, you don't care about the shelves anyway. And then up at the top, what I can do is I can change this menu here. It says modeling, and when it says modeling, I've got my mesh, edit mesh, mesh tools, mesh display, all my modeling menus. I can just switch it over to rigging, and now I've got my skeleton, skin, deform, constrain. Those are the menus I'm going to need. So again, my workspace is set to General. My menu set is switched to rigging. So, the first thing we're going to do is make a skeleton, and that means we're going to use this skeleton menu here. In it, the first option is to create joints, and joints are rotation points. So if you think about your human body, there are lots of places that you, as a human being, bend. Your shoulders, your elbows, your wrists, your knees, your ankles, your toes, all of those things are bendy points. And those are where we're going to build joints for the skeleton too. In this menu there are some other important commands. Mirror joints means that you only have to make the left side, and Maya will build the right side of the skeleton for you, which is lovely. Orient Joint attempts to make sure that all of your joints rotate along the same axis, which is also really important. And Reroute Skeleton allows you to reset the skeleton to use a different joint as the root, or the most important joint, which is really nice because it means that you can change the center of gravity of your skeleton as needed. This is where I can make IK handles too, and we'll talk about IK handles when we need them, which will be pretty soon. Not immediately, but pretty soon. So this first menu is where we're going to live for this first little bit, and then we'll move over to skin, and we'll talk about skin binding and weight painting, and then finally we'll move over to constrain and use that to set up all of our controls. So for starters, I will go to create joints. And the first thing you need to know about joints is that they are construction objects, which means that they function kind of the same way that your curves do. In other words, when I draw them, if I draw them here in the perspective view, no matter where I think I'm putting them, I am actually putting them along the YZ plane. So I need to be aware the XZ plane. So I need to be aware of which orthographic view will best suit me. So for example, if I wanted to make a leg, I would probably start in my side view and say, this is where my hip is, this is where my knee is, here's my ankle, this is the ball of the foot where the toe lives. I might snap this to this grid point. This is the toe, and then back here, this is the heel. So I've built my chain here in the side view, and when I look in 3D, it has managed to build itself way over here, which actually is not that bad. So with this chain, I've got 6 joints. The first one is my hip joint, and I'm going to be really careful with my nomenclature. So anytime I've got something that I think I'm going to use, like for serious, I'm going to bind this to my skin, I'm going to make sure that it says JT in it. So this next one is my knee joint, and then I've got my ankle. Let's make sure I spelled that correctly. Ankle joint. This is the ball of the foot joint, and then I've got my toes, which I'm not necessarily going to bind to the skin. They just don't matter that much. And the same thing with the heel. I'm not necessarily going to bind this to the skin. It doesn't matter that much. The reason for that is pretty simple. The ankle controls the rotation of the heel. Since it's higher up in the chain, it's really what I'm principally going to use for the heel. And down here I've got this ball joint. The ball joint rotates the toe. And in fact, you see when I'm doing that I get this big line moving down to the heel. So if I were to bind the toe and the heel, my whole foot would flop out of control. Now, the next thing about nomenclature that you need to know is that with rigging, you have to be very specific about what everything is. So this isn't just the hip joint. I'm going to have 2 legs. This one is the left side. So in Modify, there is a prefix hierarchy name option. I can Control-Shift left click and add that to my shelf here, or I can just run it. I'm going to give this an LF underscore prefix. LF for left. I love an underscore in my prefixes, and I like LF for left because it's an unusual letter combination, and if I'm doing a search or a search and replace, that's going to show up right away. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say this joint chain is not centered within the model at all. So what I probably need to do is take it, go to my front view, and start moving it into position. With this, there are 2 ways to move a joint. First, you can use the Move tool and just move the joint. The second way is to select your joint and press the D key on your keyboard. The D key will allow you to move this joint without moving the other joints in the chain. Oop. Control Z. So this way I can either move my joint all by itself or my joint with all the other joints in the chain. I think this one is still a little bit out of position, so I will press D and just move this. Maybe pull it down a little too. And now I can see my joint is centered within the leg at all times. If you can't see your skeleton at this point, the shading menu has an X-ray joints option. Turning that on or off will allow you to see the skeleton through the model, or not. The last thing I like to do with my joints is this. This left hip joint here is currently the root of the chain. That should be the largest joint. This heel joint here is the last and least important joint in the chain. It should be the smallest joint. So I'm going to set my character geo to be templated so that I'm not selecting it all the time. And then I can go into my channel box, and I can't scale joints, but I can reset their radius value. So maybe this one's set to 0.6 right now, maybe I'll turn it down to 0.2, and that'll make it tiny. The toes as well, I will set this to 0.2. Then the ball of the foot is a little bit more important. Let's turn that up to maybe a 0.35. So it's a little bigger, a little easier to select. You know, I want that to be easy to see. Maybe I'll go up to a 4.5. And then 0.4, 0.4, and sure, we'll make this one a 0.6. So I can resize my joints by adjusting this radius option. I want to be sure that all of my joints are well named. I want to be sure that they all have a nice prefix in front of them. And I want to be sure that they are all centered within the model. So that's going to be my first joint chain, and I will pause here to let all of you catch up with me.